Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Camille Moore with Connect, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in to How to Develop a Learning Strategy that Creates Value with Nawn. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes on the platform. You can type in your questions for John in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'd like this to be an interactive session, so please send in questions throughout the webinar if you would like through the chat box. At the bottom of your screen, you will notice several widgets, which include one with today's handout, the handout today's presentation. Please be sure to download that if you would like. A recorded version of this session will be available on demand on our website, where you can find additional on-demand webinars for any of you needing last-minute credit hours before CMP testing. Yes, you are still able to watch our sessions on demand and still receive credits. For anyone joining us live today, the CMP credit was approved for 1 credit hour for CMP IS Domain A Strategic Planning. For everyone joining us live today, we'll be sending out an email tomorrow evening with your certificate of attendance. For any of you future viewers watching this session on demand and not live, please email me directly at cmore@connectmeetings.com to receive your certificate. I'll type in my email address in 1 second. I'll share more information about our upcoming webinars at the end of the program, but let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank Great Wolf Lodge for sponsoring today's session. Here's some more information about the resort. At all 18 locations across North America, Great Wolf Lodge begins by ensuring their teams are the most responsive in the industry. Add that to the configurable meeting space, fully integrated audio-visual, and separate conference center entrances with satellite check-in capabilities. The result, your meeting will be great. They have many locations conveniently located near major metro areas, or in some cases, established tourism destinations throughout North America. Great Wolf Lodge has oversized and spacious guest suites that offer a semi-private seating room and work area, refrigerator, and microwave. All locations also provide complimentary high-speed wireless internet access throughout their entire lodge and conference centers. Their chefs are known to deliver a creative and exceptional dining experience, all while adhering to your budget guidelines and accommodating any unique dietary aids. Great Wolf Lodge believes their people are their competitive advantage. From the initial planning to the closing remarks, feel confident knowing you are supported by an entire team of meeting professionals fully invested in your success. For more information about Great Wolf Lodge, please visit greatwolf.com/meetings. Thank you again, Great Wolf. Before I introduce John, if you notice on your screen, this is a map of some of our upcoming events that we have this year, one being our Connect Mega event in Salt Lake City, which will feature Connect Corporate, Expo, Specialty, Sports, and Specialty. If you'd like any more information on Connect Mega, please email my coworker Kristen Francis at kfrancis@connectmeetings.com. Here's her email address if you would like more information. Registration for Connect Mega will be closing soon, just an FYI. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nawn. Nawn is the founder and CEO of The Perfect Meeting, which designs formal and informal learning and content strategies that help organizations grow revenues and increase market share. John has served as Chief Learning Officer for several multinational corporations and associations across different industries. Unlike most learning professionals, John specializes in monetizing learning. His learning programs have generated over $200 million in revenues and cost savings. John, welcome. Thank you for sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me, Camille. And thank you all for joining us, too, out there. Why is a learning strategy for your meeting or event important? Why are we even talking about this? Well, in my judgment, because today we're doing a lousy job of providing our attendees with even the most basic knowledge and skills in order to be successful. Today, we don't design our learning programs for better retention and knowledge transfer, the only outcome measures that really matter. And because today, we're using inefficient and ineffective means of identifying learning needs, designing, developing, and delivering learning programs, and evaluating the results in ways that lead to individual and organizational performance improvement. Again, the only meaningful goals of any learning initiative. So if your learning strategy doesn't address these deficits, you're failing your attendees, and more importantly, the organization's falling further and further behind the proverbial learning curve every day. So building your learning strategy of higher order cognitive skills and using empirically derived competency-based models and sound instructional system design methodologies, you'll have a learning strategy that's responsive to the changing needs of individuals and organizations. So these are the objectives we're going to have today. I'm going to talk a little bit about making the business case for learning as a competitive advantage, identify some best practices, and then I'm going to talk about some emerging trends that should also be incorporated into your learning strategy. So let's get going. So most of you probably never heard of a learning strategy before. I'll explain what it is by using a business strategy, an example, a term you're more likely familiar with. So what's a business strategy? It's a working plan that defines your long-term business goals and objectives and outlines the steps necessary to achieve them. It defines the purpose of the business, its strengths, your target market, and your product and service offerings. And once you formulate your plan, you must develop, implement, and evaluate the plan and make improvements as needed. Now more than ever, a business strategy is a living, breathing document that needs to be flexible enough for the changing times that we live in. So what's a learning strategy? Following the business strategy definition, it's a working plan that defines your long-term learning goals and objectives and outlines the steps necessary to achieve them. Like a business strategy, it also defines the purpose of your learning function, its particular strengths, your target market, and your learning products and services. And like a business strategy, once you've formulated your plan, you have to develop, implement, and evaluate, and make improvements as needed. Your learning plan also has to be flexible enough to accommodate the changing needs of your learners. Now, your business strategy and your learning strategy should be aligned. By definition, as we just saw, they're intimately connected. You can't accomplish one without the other because, as one Fortune 500 CEO said, learning function's role is to help organization and the people depend upon it learn, adapt, and grow. Simply put, agile organizations and individuals who can more easily adapt to a changing environment or learn actually perform better. Only about 20% of organizations have a learning strategy, and less than 5% of those keep it up to date. And in informal research that I've conducted, these numbers are significantly lower if you work for an association. So, if a business strategy depends on goals and objectives, let's define what those are. A business goal is an observable and measurable end result having one or more objectives to be achieved within a more or less fixed time frame. Here's some examples of business goals and the more specific objectives that align with them. So, if your goal is to increase revenues, for example, your objectives might be to exceed your sales target by 5% or obtain 75 new customers per month. If your goal is to increase market effectiveness, your objectives might be to reduce costs per lead by 5% or reduce lead cycle time by 10%, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is how we write goals and objectives based on business goals and objectives. Now, here are some examples of learning goals and objectives that align with the aforementioned business goals and objectives. So if you want to increase revenues, you have to train 100% of your salespeople on a new sales strategy. You have to enroll all your new customers and channel partners into an onboarding program, for example. So the point I want to make here is that whatever your business goals and objectives, it's possible, indeed it's imperative, to develop complementary learning goals and objectives. We're not going to get into how to actually develop or write business and learning goals and objectives in this webinar. For those of you who are interested in that, you can contact me afterwards for a free handout on writing goals and objectives, which I'll make available to you. Suffice it to say, there are a couple of commonly used methods like the ABCD method and my preferred favorite, the STEM method. And those are going to be in the handout if you're interested. Every business strategy consists of these basic elements: mission statement, vision statements, goals and objectives, strategies, and action plans. And every business plan consists of these basic elements: the executive summary, the business description, market analysis, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, your learning strategy and your learning plan should include these same elements. And we're not going to have time to drill down into great detail in these in this webinar, but let me highlight some of the key elements of a learning strategy and plan. So a mission statement explains why you exist. Vision statement describes where you see yourself in the future. Goals and objectives are objectives are actually much more tactical, short-term, concrete, tangible than a goal, and they change more often as well. Strategies are the plans you put in place to accomplish your goals and objectives. And finally, action plans are simply the actions that you take to implement your strategies. Who does what when? As with any business, the most important strategy elements are your mission and your vision statements. Everything else is determined by those elements. So here's an example of a mission and a vision statement for a learning function within an organization. So the mission statement here for this organization is to provide the information their audience needs, when they need to know it, in the manner that's most convenient for them. And their vision statement is to be the definitive thought leader in that industry. Of course, the devil's in the details. Your specific goals and objectives, strategies, and action plans are going to vary, but if these are your guiding statements, your mission and vision statements, what strategic pieces do you have to have in place in order to realize that mission and vision? So before you get started developing your learning strategy, your first order of business is more likely going to be to educate your stakeholders about the business case for learning. So let's take a look at how you might go about doing that. So I don't know if you knew, but there's a knowledge gap out there. On January 1st, 2011, the oldest member of the baby boom generation turned 65, commonly considered retirement age. On that day, and for every day for the next 20 years until 2030, 10,000 baby boomers will retire every day. That's 4 million people per year, 80 million people in all. What this means is that organizations of every shape and size are losing experienced workers to retirement. They're walking out the front door with all their work experience and institutional knowledge, and organizations are doing very little to attempt to capture or retain that experience and knowledge so that future generations don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Compounding the problem, most boomers hold leadership positions, leaving huge leadership gaps as well. So things like coaching and mentoring, including reverse mentoring, are potential gap solutions, but clearly more needs to be done. 1 in 10, only 1 in 10 organizations say their employees have the necessary skills to be successful at their jobs. 60% of job vacancies stay open for 12 weeks or longer, which speaks to how much harder it is to find qualified workers to fill those existing vacancies. So the challenge finding qualified workers contributes to all sorts of issues for organizations: productivity losses, higher employment turnover, lower morale, lower quality work, the inability to grow their businesses, and revenue losses. In addition, 20% of employees say their knowledge, skills, and abilities, their KSAs as we call them, are not up to date. And 60% of employees want to learn a new skill for their job, but can't afford to. So our ability to learn, to acquire knowledge of, or skill in some topic is perhaps our greatest differentiator and a critical competitive advantage in today's marketplace. Learning is at the core of our abilities to create, to innovate, and to make more informed business decisions. So try and name another competency that's more critical to your professional development or your business. And you can use the chat feature here to share your thoughts. For me, it all begins and ends with learning. So let's look at some of the key reasons why learning is a competitive advantage and why we need to take it more seriously than we do now. So economists disagree about many things. but they all agree that today we're living in a knowledge economy in which economic growth is dependent on our ability to leverage information, our ability to learn. During the next economic downturn, which is on its way, only those individuals and those organizations who are able to leverage information to learn and adapt will survive. In this knowledge economy that we're living in, I believe only the smart will survive. Good news is that corporations and associations are uniquely positioned to address both these issues, the knowledge gap and the skill gap, if they're willing to act now and act boldly. So our existing learning models and paradigms are no longer sufficient to capitalize, because this is a revenue issue, on these opportunities. So what, you might ask, does this have to do with meetings and events? To answer that question, I've got one for you. That is, why do we meet? Why do you meet? What do you think the most common reason are for people to meet? And you can, again, use the chat window to share your thoughts on this if you like. Here's my answer. In industry research going back decades, the top two reasons people attend meetings and events, and all other reasons pale in comparison, are for the educational programs and the networking opportunities. And in the language of learning professionals, like myself, we call these formal and informal learning, respectively. These are essentially two sides of the same coin. And what we know about informal learning is that it trumps formal learning in terms of two key metrics we use to determine a program's success: retention rates and knowledge transfer. If your formal or informal learning opportunities are not designed to increase retention rates or the transfer of knowledge back to the job, and most aren't, you're literally wasting your time at meetings and events. Given the number of people attending meetings and events, some have called this the greatest waste of human capital, period, ever, period. Sadly, I'm having trouble coming up with something greater. According to the U.S. Department of Education, there are about 5,000 institutions of higher learning in the U.S., 2-year, 4-year, public and private, and at any one point in time, there are approximately 33 million students enrolled in these institutions. In contrast, according to the Events Industry Council's research on the economic significance of meetings and events, which is recently updated, in the U.S. alone, there are approximately 1.9 million meetings held every year, attended by approximately 225 million people. So most of those meetings include at least one formal learning program, and often many, many more. This means the meetings and events industry is responsible for more professional development of adults than all of higher education combined by a factor of almost 7. So this is both a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity for organizations to play a more significant role in the professional development of the global workforce. A core competency of organizations is professional development, or continuing education, if you prefer. In fact, many executives claim this is perhaps their most important value proposition. And I'm not sure if you can name another one, but again, feel free to use the chat window if you like. Compounding the knowledge and skill gaps is the fact that corporate learning budgets are flat or rising only slightly. Pending recession means that learning budgets are vulnerable if individual and organizational performance improvements cannot be documented or demonstrated. So if you want to make sure your learning programs have a fighting chance when the cost cutting begins, you need to have your metrics and measurement systems in place, which I'll talk about later. To further illustrate how wasteful most learning programs are, the dirty little secret of the learning industry is that 80% of our formal learning programs contribute to only 20% of on-the-job performance. Let that sink in for just a minute. 80% of your formal learning programs are only contributing 20% of performance improvement. So the development of formal programs also takes about 80% of our overall learning budgets, yet 80% of what we learn comes via these informal learning opportunities where we're spending relatively little. So clearly, our spending priorities are not aligned with our performance priorities. Think of how much more successful we might be individually as well as organizationally if we started focusing more of our efforts on optimizing informal learning opportunities where the proverbial rubber hits the road. So I believe we need to get a lot smarter about learning. So when it comes to developing your learning strategy, you've got your work cut out for you before you even get started. Look at these common implementation challenges. All the more reason to be taking a comprehensive approach that follows a logical process. So if you want to have a successful learning strategy, you have to have some key pieces in place. These are some of the essential pieces I believe you should consider. First off here is a learning needs analysis. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. A competency model, which grows out of your learner needs analysis. You need learning professionals, and I'm going to talk about them and their particular competencies as well. And then at some point, if you want to expand online, and most people do, you're going to have to adopt an LMS or an LCMS. It's a learning management system or a learning content management system. And then finally, an evaluation system, and I think this is the most critical, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and I have another job aid there to help you with that as well. Of course, none of this should be undertaken or will succeed without the support and commitment of both financial and human resources by your senior leadership team. So many organizational leaders acknowledge the important learning plays in improving individual organizational performance. They know how to talk the talk, but don't necessarily know what it means to walk the walk. And I believe it's your opportunity, your responsibility in some respects, to help them with this. And hopefully I'm giving you some of the tools to do that. So here's what I consider to be best practices when it comes to developing a comprehensive learning strategy for your meetings and events. Every meaningful learning strategy is built upon Bloom's taxonomy. There's really no alternative. Bloom's taxonomy was created in 1956 under the leadership of an educational psychologist named Benjamin Bloom in order to promote higher forms of thinking in education, such as analyzing and evaluating concepts, processes, procedures, and principles, not simply remembering facts or rote learning. So these strategies start with the most basic form of learning, like remembering, the recognition and recalling of facts, and get more sophisticated from there. Goal is to enable learners to ultimately develop new ways of thinking. And that gets back to that issue of creativity or innovation, to monetize your creative ideas. Therefore, the goal of any learning program or content developer is to develop higher order cognitive thinking from lower level cognitive skills. With today's increasingly competitive business environment, rote learning is no longer sufficient. Needs analysis. So a need is a discrepancy or gap between the current state and a desired state. If an individual lacks the knowledge or skill to successfully perform the various tasks that make up a job, a learning need has been identified. A formal needs analysis involves gathering information from multiple sources in multiple ways, like interviews, observation, reviewing of materials, surveys, etc. And a typical analysis consists of several steps. There could be an organizational analysis, which identifies the goals, resources, constraints, what sort of support is available, etc. There's a learner analysis, which really focuses more on the demographics of your audience, the performance challenges, the current state, the desired state, the definition of success, etc. And there's a formal job or task analysis, which focuses on different performance measures, the frequency of performance, the difficulty of performance, the importance of performance, and the different steps that comprise those tasks and subtasks. There's an instructional analysis, which again determines outcomes, goals and objectives, defining your tasks and subtasks, etc., instructional methodologies. And then finally, a content analysis can be part of this analysis as well, which is about resources and reference material available for building your learning programs, etc. Sometimes done as part of a task analysis. So competency models identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities, or attitudes, what we call KSAs, that determine successful performance on any job. So your job analysis and your needs analysis in turn helps you identify your competency model. So most organizations don't use an empirically based competency model when developing their formal learning programs. But without a competency model, your formal learning programs are a little more than an educated guess at best, and at worst, just wishful thinking. So your job analysis and your needs analysis will help you better understand your target audience or audiences, the specific duties and tasks of the job, the environmental conditions of the job, any on-the-job relationships with others, the KSAs, which instructional strategies and methods will work best, how to evaluate your performance, etc., so that your formal learning programs hit their mark and are more successful. So here's an example of a competency model for meeting and event professionals. The MBEX stands for Meeting and Business Event Competency Standards. This was published back in 2012. All professional development for MICE professionals should fall into one of these 12 competency areas. Otherwise, in my judgments, it's considered a waste of time. The ADDIE model is a generic process traditionally used by instructional designers and learning program developers. The 5 phases, analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation, represent a dynamic, flexible guidelines for building effective learning programs and performance support tools. It's an instructional system design model, or ISD model. And most other instructional design models are variations of the ADDIE model. One commonly accepted improvement to this model is the use of rapid prototyping. This is the idea of receiving continual informative feedback while instructional materials are being created. This model attempts to save time and money by catching potential problems where they're still easy to fix. And most contemporary instructional designers are using this. This brings us to the idea of developing your learning programs according to adult learning principles. In 1984, Malcolm Knowles explained how adults learn differently than children and introduced a number of principles he considered imperative to successful learning. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but among the most important principles are adults need to know why they should learn something. They have a lot of life experience and have the right to know what's in it for them, the with them. Adults are also self-directed. They like to be more involved in determining what and how they learn. And adults have intrinsic as well as extrinsic, or internal and external motivations for learning and demand relevance to their jobs. This all seems rather sensible and fairly reasonable, doesn't it? A comprehensive understanding of these principles is critical to developing successful educational programs that result in participant engagement and the facilitation of learning. So your principles are key here as well. And learning professionals understand better than anyone else how to incorporate these principles into their program. So when it comes to actually developing formal learning programs, we simply have to do a better job of this. These programs constitute the majority of learning opportunities which we spend most of our time and money on, and they're just not doing the job. They're not contributing significantly to improving individual and organizational performance. Now, we know this because, for the most part, our formal learning programs are not developed by learning professionals who have specific training in diagnosing performance problems. It's more than just a knowledge and skill issue. Those adult learning principles that I just talked about, using the ADDIE model of instructional design, curriculum development, etc. Learning professionals utilize a variety of tools and techniques and principles when designing their formal learning programs. So many of these principles have been around since the 1940s, but are not standard practice in our industry because we simply don't employ a lot of learning professionals, which again is amazing considering the amount of professional development we're responsible for, as I mentioned earlier. So you wouldn't hire a beginner to run your association or a non-professional to plan your annual meeting. I suggest you don't leave your program development for amateurs. Here's a competency model of learning professionals. These competencies are, and I'm just going to cover some of those: performance improvement, instructional design, training delivery, learning technologies, which is a burgeoning area, evaluating their learning impact, et cetera, et cetera. So if those responsible for developing your learning programs are not knowledgeable or skilled in these competency areas, you're doing your audience a disservice. So I mentioned earlier that the only meaningful outcomes of any learning program are better retention and knowledge transfer back to the job. Otherwise, again, we're wasting our time reading these events. So just by definition here, retention is the ability to recall or recognize things in our minds. More specifically, it's the process by which new information is transferred from our short-term to our long-term memory. A knowledge transfer, just to explain this just clearly so we know what terms we're talking about here, this is the exchange of knowledge between and among individuals and within and among teams, organizational units, organizations. So that's what we're really trying to accomplish with our learning programs. Do you know that learners forget approximately 60% of what they learn in the first hour, 75% of what they learn in the first week, and 90% of what they learn in 2 to 4 weeks unless it's being reinforced? Sadly, most formal learning programs do not emphasize reinforcement learning during, much less after, the program has concluded. This is a huge mistake and, of course, a huge opportunity to develop better programs that might contribute more to performance improvement. So this is not rocket science. If we want to increase retention rates, these are some of the things you should incorporate into your formal learning programs. For better memory representation or retention, try to use more mnemonics or encoding techniques. Try chunking information into bite-sized pieces for easier absorption into short-term memory, anticipating that we're distracted at work every 9 to 11 minutes and it can take 23 minutes to get back on task. To simplify learning, I like to use infographics. I'm a big fan of job aids and other performance tools. Where do those job aids go? There used to be a lot of them. The internet is not a suitable substitute. Strive to use more real-world examples or case studies. The more realistic, the more transferable to the job. Finally, include active recall. For example, spaced repetition or knowledge checks throughout the lesson, not just at the end. Send reminders, post-learning for reinforcement. Pre-test and post-test are options we don't use very often. I don't know where all the tests went, but we don't seem to be using them very much anymore either. Now, I want to acknowledge that these ideas take some expertise, some time, and sometimes more budget to do right. But I believe that if your objective is sustainable performance improvement, they're a worthwhile investment. I can tell you from experience that for well-designed learning programs, the return far outweighs the costs. So because informal learning is so much more relevant than formal learning when it comes to performance, we have to be shifting more resources into designing informal learning opportunities. Learning is a cognitive process that takes place in a social context. We learn from each other, whether that's through observation or direct instruction. Most networking is instruction, and therefore the learning benefits are left to chance. So it doesn't take much to include some intent, some goal or objective into networking so folks derive the maximum value for these opportunities. Related to structuring networking opportunities is thinking small in terms of group size. Small group discussions are the most popular format folks prefer in their formal and informal learning opportunities. Yes, most common meeting formats we use today are still large and lecture-driven. We're not doing ourselves any favors here. So if you haven't heard about personalized or customized learning yet, you're about to. What most folks don't realize is that the key to developing and delivering personalized or customized learning is data. You have to know your audience at a much more intimate level than you currently do. Now, most organizations have some rudimentary understanding of their audience. As a result, they provide rudimentary learning. So if you really need your audience to perform, you're going to have to get to know them better, and that means adding psychographic data, for example, the study of wants, needs, interests, and attitudes to your existing demographic data in order to create more robust audience profiles. The ultimate objective of personalized or customized learning is to develop, again, what they need to know, when they need to know it, in the manner that's most convenient for them. We can't do this unless we have a more complete understanding of our audience. And finally, just as I recommend hiring the professionals when it comes to developing and delivering learning, I recommend hiring the professionals when it comes to informal learning. Like meeting professionals, professional facilitators, for example, will save you significant time and money by helping you accomplish your learning goals and objectives. Too many of us think too highly of our facilitation skills. Now, I'm not saying that facilitators are required for every learning opportunity, just the ones that matter to your organization. In terms of developing your online learning capabilities, posting PowerPoint presentations, which I see a lot of, is not the same as providing online learning. E-learning is actually more challenging to design than face-to-face learning. The difference in development ratios averages 40 to 1 for face-to-face learning versus 160 to 1 for basic level online learning. Again, you'll be better off in the long run by hiring the professionals, in this case instructional designers with experience specifically designing e-learning programs. So at some point, if you haven't already, you're also going to have to bite the bullet and invest in an LMS or an LCMS, a learning management system or learning content management system, to manage your online learning programs. As with all major purchases, buyer beware. Not all LMSs and LCMSs are created equal. These platforms are developed by technology companies that don't necessarily understand learning, They often have limited functionality and not easy to customize to meet your organizational specific needs. So talk to your peers, conduct a good needs analysis in order to create a more informed RFP. One scary statistic to keep in mind is the average shelf life of an LMS is about 3 years. And that's not a very long time for a 7-figure purchase. So when it comes to building out your LMS or your LCMS, you start small, scale up from them. You should understand the learning priorities of your audience, align your development plans with these. The job analysis and copy model we talked about earlier will be invaluable in this regard. I've seen too many clients port their existing content into their LMS and their LCMS only to find out that nobody really cared about that outdated, oftentimes obsolete content to begin with. So you have to seek to put a variety of content into your learning platform. Different content addresses different needs, and folks consume content differently. For example, video is on the rise, no one's surprised. Formal courses, webinars, white papers, case studies, infographics, third-party links, etc. Your content should cover these bases and more. Finally, if you're not thinking about M-learning or mobile learning, now's the time to do so. Increasingly, our device of choice is our mobile platforms. Instructional designers have figured out how to develop learning for these platforms. Your audience is already consuming most of their content via mobile devices. You just need to get with the program. There will be growing pains, but what you absolutely don't want is your audience turning elsewhere for their professional development needs. So finally, we come to what I consider to be the most important factor in determining whether your learning programs are engaging, motivating, and result in some individual or organizational performance improvement. Industry research shows that most organizations aren't collecting much information, aren't collecting the right information, and most importantly, they don't have the analytical interpretive expertise to translate their data into actionable business decisions. So we have to start measuring what matters. Most post-event program evaluations are measuring logistics and not learning. They're more of a performance review for a meeting professional as opposed to an indication of whether the meeting had any impact on the business or not. So newer metrics and measurement systems that capture those metrics are required. So some of you may be familiar with Don Kirkpatrick's or Jack Phillips' level of learning program evaluation. Level 1 here is about just reaction. These are about initial impressions, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Level 2 is learning. Was there any change in knowledge, skills, or attitudes, or KSAs? Level 3 is about behavior. What is the change in individual performance? Level 4 is about the business impact or results. Was there any change in organizational performance? And level 5 is the ROI. What was the contribution to the organization's bottom line? So about 40% of organizations are measuring level 1, just these initial impressions, primarily as it pertains to meeting logistics. Only about 5% are measuring level 2, whether there was any learning that took place at all. So you don't need to measure level 5 or ROI for all your meetings and events, but I do recommend you measure it for your most important ones. After all, your stakeholders might ask you if they're getting what they're getting for their investment in time and money that you put into the meeting and event, and you want to be able to have a definitive answer to that question. Of all the other topics that I've covered today, this one change in how you measure the effectiveness of your learning programs will make the most difference. Everything else is just rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. Pointless unless you're measuring what you're doing. So here's an instrument I use for evaluating learning programs, and it can be customized to apply to programs, courses, sessions, etc., and recreated in any format, even an event app. For clients, I recommend using this in place of all other program, course, or session evaluations because it's collecting more actionable data. And over time, my clients have been able to use this information to make more substantive changes in both their formal and their informal learning programs. So this often precipitates modifying your overall event evaluations too, as the organization starts to focus more clearly on their specific goals and objectives and how their efforts are aligning. So the neat thing is that these questions align with Kirkpatrick's and Phillips' models of learning program evaluation, the 5 levels that we just showed earlier. And I know of no other evaluation that does this. So first, we're asking here about instructor effectiveness, and there's a couple of questions that pertain to that. That's level 1. Level 2 is learning effectiveness, asking a couple of questions about that. And these are subjective, self-evaluations, right, that they're giving us in a survey format. Level 3 here is impact on the job. I'll be able to apply the knowledge or skill learned in the session And we asked them to rate this on a percentage basis. And there's some more job impact questions. What percentage of their work time requires the knowledge presented in the program, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get into business results, level 4, I'm sorry. We're asking specifically about job performance and asking them to estimate how much of their performance is related to the subject matter. And we ask specific outcome metrics as well about increasing quality or increasing productivity, customer employee satisfaction, et cetera. Again, your outcome variables are going to vary, but this is what you can insert into your program evaluation as well. We asked some questions about support tools, and importantly here, it's about whether you and your manager are on the same page in terms of why you're going to this learning opportunity and what you're going to get out of it, and how your performance is going to benefit as a result. Research shows that that piece in place makes a significant difference. And finally, we asked some questions about ROI. Again, this is subjective. This is a self-evaluation, but this is helpful as well. So I see people jumping on this. You can contact me afterwards for this handout as well. Again, this is going to be free and available to you. There'll be those two handouts, the one on writing objectives and this one on the program evaluation. I have a template for you that you can, again, easily adopt and modify for your own purposes. So when it comes to increasing engagement, it all comes down to format. Older formats like lectures, which we're still using too much, as I said before, are monologues in a world that's screaming for dialogues. So here are some more participant-centric meeting and presentation formats that you should consider incorporating into your meeting event mix. So there's open space technology, or OST, where participants create multi-tracked agendas and adhere to the following principles, and I love these principles. Whoever comes are the right people. Whenever it starts is the right time. Wherever it happens is the right place. Whatever happens is the only thing that could have. When it's over, it's over. You do the work and not the time. And most importantly, I love this, the law of 2 feet, or the law of mobility, sometimes it's called, which stipulates that if you're not getting anything out of the session that you're in, use your 2 feet, find another one that's more meaningful and valuable to you. There's things like unconferences, which is similar to OST, but particularly useful when participants have a particular high level of expertise or knowledge and subject matter experts. Those of you know him, I'm not a big fan of panels because most folks aren't willing to put in the time and energy to do them right. But I like unpanels. It's a form of dialogue that can be used when discussing topics within large groups. The advantage is it allows the entire group to participate in those conversations. World cafes, again, also very beneficial, that are good for more in-depth exploration of subjects and related issues. And then I'm also a big fan of graphic recording or graphic facilitators, which is about strategically combining words and images to convey information. You've seen some of this, I'm sure, before. And the game storming is really popular and catching on even more. So there's games or structured activities that support creative problem solving, for examples. So you can find more about these formats, including how-tos, on my website or by Googling each term if you like. When it comes to more engaging presentation formats, mini lectures or TED-like talks, these are abbreviated talks designed to focus on the messenger as well as the message. Be cautious, however. A lot of people try these, but they're harder to do well than they look. So TED Talks themselves are highly curated. Most attempts I've seen to try to replicate them fail miserably. Shorter is better has been a rallying cry for program developers for a while, but I would also add only if they're designed well. I'm going to butcher this. I always call it Pachachka, and I'm sure I butchered this. The other alternative here is the Ignite. So these are timed, PowerPoint-driven presentations. Both formats' popularity is a function of their easy accessibility. Anyone basically can do it. And the rapid and often entertaining short story format. It's a visual storytelling at its most basic. Ignites are just a few minutes shorter than Pachachka. Story slams, a la The Moth, if you haven't heard of The Moth. They have a wonderful website with great examples. But here participants tell short 5-minute stories, usually following a chosen theme. I recommend some curation is useful in these as well. There's buzz groups, which are a form of brainstorming where small groups break off and come back to the larger group after they've generated ideas. And then mashups as well. Again, you can find out more about these formats on my website or by Googling each term. So the old saying, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, applies to learners as well. So you can have all the pieces in place, but if your learners may be reluctant to still take advantage of them. That's why we have to understand what motivates the adult learner. So there are 6 major internal and external factors here that motivate adult learners. These should be incorporated into your formal and informal learning programs. So learning is the motivations for learning revolve around social relationships because learning is a social experience. This is about collaborating, communicating, and our yearning for connection with others. External expectations about fulfilling the expectations or recommendations of subordinates or peers to superiors. Social welfare is about serving the community or communities that we're all a part of. Personal advancement is obvious. This is about your status or staying abreast of your competitors. Escape or stimulation. This is about learning something new and different, relieving boredom or providing a break in our routines. And finally, cognitive interest. This is about just seeking knowledge for its own sake to satisfy our curiosity about the world around us. Finally, we have to realize there are a number of barriers to both motivation and performance, and as learning professionals, we have to account for these in our program design as well. So when it comes to motivation, the 2 primary barriers, oftentimes not enough time and not enough money. Interest or relevance can also be a significant barrier. When it comes to performance barriers, these factors get in the way 80% more often than knowledge and skill, which is generally the focus of most formal learning programs. So most employees aren't really sure what's expected of them on the job, and most bosses aren't particularly good at articulating that or providing good feedback. Most employees report not having access to the right tools to do their job. The work environment is also problematic. Many employees claim they are more productive working from home. Rewards and recognition incentives is all about making sure employees are sufficiently motivated and that the right behavior is being targeted. And capacity is more than just IQ. These days it's more about EQ or emotional intelligence, which many argue is more important than IQ. Finally, there's no arguing that knowledge and skill are critical, but if you don't address these other factors, your learning programs are not likely to have the impact on the individual and organizational performance improvement. These barriers will doom your program before they're even developed if you're not addressing them. So unfortunately, there are a lot of myths out there that make our work as learning professionals more challenging. These myths get in the way of developing legitimate, effective learning programs that result in individual and organizational performance improvement. But make no mistake, there are no shortcuts to developing effective learning programs. If your learning strategy relies on these myths, it's time to rethink your strategy. So I'll cover a few of these that I noticed get in the way. First of all, learning styles, right? So I hate to tell you, but there's no empirical evidence learners benefit from matching to a particular style of learning, whether it's auditory, visual, or kinesthetic. And I know this is a very popular myth, and it's held on for a long time. If you are if you're using professionals and they are developing well-designed content using an ADDIE model or some formal process like that, the more often than not, you're going to have be able to address the learning needs of all these individuals in your audience. Left and right brain. Again, no empirical evidence. People preferentially use their left or right brain hemisphere, right? So there's a lateralization, which means there's a lot of connections between both hemispheres. Some hemispheres are more functional than others in different areas, but they work together, highly interconnected. Here's another one, the 10,000-hour rule. Again, popularized by Malcolm Gladwell's book and Eric Erickson's research. Again, no magic number here to achieve expertise or proficiency in any particular field. Practice matters, just not as much as we think. Reminds me of that old joke about how you get to Carnegie Hall. Practice, practice, practice. And then, this is a good one. We only use 10% of our brain. Again, this was misquoted in Dale Carnegie's book from 1936, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's been an urban legend popularized in other literature and movies as far back as the 1930s. But again, there are things we can do to study smarter and retain more about what we do, make our learning more efficient, but this 10% rule is also bogus. Finally, the learning pyramid, right? So you've heard this before. We remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, et cetera, but these numbers are nonsense, and the order is potency is, of course, incorrect. So this doesn't work either. So I wanted to share some ideas with you that are already having a profound effect on everyone's learning strategy. So these trends are only going to accelerate, so the sooner you incorporate them into your learning strategy, the better off you and your learners will be. So here is this idea of free, and this I'm actually fascinated by this. This is started by what we call MOOCs, or massive open online courses. They are here, and they are disrupting many traditional channels and learning providers. You've probably heard of some of these popular peer-to-peer platforms like Khan Academy or Brainly or TribeLearn. Many traditional learning institutions are getting into MOOCs big time with surprising results. edX is a joint MOOC from MIT and Harvard. It has hundreds of thousands of students enrolled, 28 million participant hours. In the first 2 years the program was launched, taking all manner of courses for free, people all over the world. And they oftentimes offer free as well as fee-based certificate programs. Personalization is the ultimate goal of any learning program. Data analytics provides the means to deliver on what we have been until now, an elusive goal. But this is coming on strong too, but as I said before, the cornerstone of that is data. Flipped classrooms are all about more efficient and more effective use of the classroom and non-class time. The rise of learning technologies and things like the internet are making this more common, much more readily available. So think about how you can incorporate technology into your face-to-face as well as your online programs. And then e-learning, its offspring, m-learning that I talked about earlier, continues to grow at a healthy clip. Keep in mind that creating effective online learning programs requires different skills than creating a traditional face-to-face learning program. Again, once again, hire the professionals. Can't emphasize that enough. And then talking about accreditation and other learning brands out there. So with the proficiency or the proliferation of MOOCs and the emphasis on greater personalization and the shifting nature of work in general, we can expect to see an explosion in the number of types of certificates and certification courses or accreditation programs. So only the best programs will be of any value, and it's still too soon to say what the best ones are. There are many industry designations available today in our industry, and I expect that to grow. So as someone who's developed a number of certification and certificate programs over the course of my career, mostly outside of the industry, I wish that the owner of these designations took their responsibility more seriously. I'm seeing a lot of proliferation, but not a lot of quality out there. And finally, lifelong learning, again, driven by the changing nature of work and the quest for better work-life balance and advances in technology. We're seeing this on the rise. We're seeing the rise of the lifelong learning. All the more reason for you and your organization to embrace learning for a competitive advantage. Learning is now a lifelong industry. So this is one of my favorite quotes here. Just threw that in for good measure. So in summary, let me see if I can wrap this up for you. There are 5 phases here that we covered in terms of developing an efficient, effective learning strategy for your organization. Let me drill down into each one of these a little bit more. So again, I want to emphasize here the proper models, principles, and methods should be repeatable and based on empirical data and sound information. This consistency will make your learning progress, your process reliable and systematic. Deployment is a function of the breadth as well as the depth of your implementation approach across all your relevant stakeholders. Ultimately, in order to be the most effective, learning needs to be embedded into your organization's DNA. It needs to be focused on your attendees' greatest challenges because it is the solution to those challenges. As we discussed earlier, learning is key to adapting, to innovating, to surviving, and ultimately thriving in this ever-changing environment that we're working in now. So in order to achieve the highest levels of individual organizational performance, you have to refine your processes. You have to keep learning, essentially. So alignment requires a common understanding of the purpose and the goals at the core of your learning strategy. It also requires the use of the right tools and techniques for planning, tracking, analyzing, and improving. And finally, once your learning strategy is deployed, the lessons learned are identified and addressed during the integration phase. It's time to measure and evaluate your performance indicators. Compare your results with reliable industry benchmarks industry leaders, or the results of initiatives implemented by competitors and organizations similar to yours. This is about the benchmarking. All right? So I want to now ask if there's any questions, and I will lift my eyes up off of my page to look at the Q&A.
There were some questions in the chat box, John. If you
okay, I'll go back to the chat box.
Yeah.
All right, should I start at the top of the chat box? Joan, good to see you. Yes, so Bloom's taxonomy you can easily Google. Sir, can you see any questions in particular you'd like me to respond to?
Well, I know Joan asked a few questions, but she had left. But she wanted to know, I guess, about the applications of learning principles and implementation.
Yeah, that's unfortunately a longer discussion than we perhaps have time for. But the principles are important. The learning professionals that you hire will understand how to apply these principles. There are some obvious as well as not so obvious things when it comes to these principles. And to be honest, not all the principles do apply in every learning situation. So again, if you've done a good job analysis and done a good needs analysis, that data is going to really help you understand which principles are going to be the most applicable when you're developing your learning programs.
There was another question, why do so few organizations/meetings evaluate the results, and why not 3-month to 6-month follow-up?
Yeah, why we don't do this is always perplexed me, because every other industry I work in, when they do learning programs, they evaluate the heck out of them. So I think it's partly a function of the fact that we are not learning professionals, and we haven't hired a lot of learning professionals. So we're relying on our standard operating procedure. And most evaluation forms that you see out there are really, if you look at them, the questions that they ask and the data that they're collecting, it's really a performance review of the professional. Did the trains run on time? Did you like, did you like the registration process, or the housing, or the food and beverage? It's a lot of these logistics-centric questions. If we're really focusing on what are the outcomes for the individuals and the organizations, we have to ask different questions, and I provided some of these here. So again, I think it's just old habits die hard, and meeting professionals have a lot on their plate. They spend very little time focusing on the learning and the learning outcomes. They're very focused on the logistics, which they're really good at, and I believe there's an opportunity for us as learning professionals to add more value by focusing more on these critical outcomes for meetings and events, and having an evaluation module in place and use that template that I've given you is a great place to start. Once you start collecting this information, you start to learning an awful lot more. It's very helpful. So again, I was talking and not reading. Is there any other questions that I can respond to? Joe mentioned Sonny Brown, who was a good graphic illustrator and facilitator. Good.
Oh.
So I'm seeing questions. So again, I have these 2 handouts available. One is on writing the learner objectives, business and learning objectives, and the other one is on program evaluation, learning program evaluations. So I think my email is up there on the slide, and if I go to the next slide to thank you all for joining me, you can email me, and I will send you both of those documents. All right.
Yes, all right. If there are no more questions, we will go ahead and conclude. I want to thank John again for such informative presentation, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. After this webinar concludes, you will be directed to a short survey. If you could please answer a few questions, just 5, that would be great for us to get some feedback for our future webinars. And you can learn about our past and upcoming webinars on all of our websites listed on the screen now. For those of you watching live today, you will receive an email with your certificate of attendance for this session tomorrow evening. Again, if you're watching on demand, please email me your certificate. It will not come to you automatically. If you have any questions, please email me at cmoore@connectmeetings.com. And we hope you'll join us again July 31st at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for another informative session with Connect speaker Will Curran. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great day and weekend.